You're watching The Legal Breakdown. So, Glenn, we've got some bombshell news here. Judge Cannon, presiding over Trump's Florida case, has postponed the trial date indefinitely. So, first of all, so as not to bury the lead here, why does Jack Smith not seek her recusal? She is screwing us around. She's interfering on Trump's behalf. She's already interfered on Trump's behalf. What does Jack Smith have to gain by keeping her in charge? Because he derives no benefit, and he only stands to get hurt from all of this. So this seems just like insane to me.
You know, Brian, I'm usually able to answer your questions, but you know what? I cannot answer an inexplicable question. It really makes no sense to me that Jack Smith is deciding to forego litigating this issue. I think win, lose, or draw, we need to get a definitive ruling out of the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals as to whether Judge Cannon has done enough to disqualify herself, because her impartiality might reasonably be questioned. That is a quote from the federal law requiring a judge to recuse themselves or giving a prosecutor enough evidence to file a motion to recuse. And, you know, one way or another, if Jack Smith were to litigate the issue and lose, at least it would be fully aired in the harsh light of day. We would know what the evidence was in favor of recusal and against recusal. We would know what law applied, and the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals would make a decision. Hopefully it would be a correct decision, an accurate and supportable decision. Why Jack Smith has declined to file that motion is beyond me.
Like, what does he have to lose here in the sense that she's already hostile to him? So I get why a normal prosecutor wouldn't want to attack the judge, because then if they lose their recusal request, then you have a terrible relationship between the judge and the prosecutor here. But Judge Cannon is already proving that she is doing everything in her power to be hostile against the prosecutors, to present herself as like an extension of Donald Trump's defense team. So really, at the end of the day, what does Jack Smith have to lose?
I don't know, because I agree with you. Judge Cannon really couldn't be any more hostile to Jack Smith or to the case that he's brought against Donald Trump. And she couldn't really do any more favors for Donald Trump. This latest one is, just the most recent in a long line of preferential decisions she's made on behalf of Donald Trump. And this is another doozy, to use a legal term. Here, she decided to indefinitely continue the trial. She hasn't even deigned to set a trial date. Now, let's back up a little bit, Brian, because many, many months ago, she set a May 20th trial date, and the parties were fine with that. And then she let deadline after deadline after deadline get extended to the point where there is now so much litigation that needs to be accomplished before the case ever gets to trial that she didn't even say, okay, folks, we're going to set an August trial date, a September trial date. She said, we're going to set no trial date. Now, mind you, after the May 20th trial date, which just today she vacated, she canceled, even though we all knew it was unrealistic. It's just around the corner, and Donald Trump is in a criminal trial in New York that will last well beyond May 20th. But even when we kind of knew that trial date was going to slip months ago, she asked the party for new proposed trial dates. Jack Smith said, we can do August. Donald Trump's team said, we can do September. That would seem to be a no-brainer. Set the darn case for September 1st, because that's basically in accordance with the positions taken by both parties, the prosecution and the defense. But no, she refused to set any trial date, and now today she has indefinitely kicked this case down the road. Why Jack Smith continues to endure this without doing what I think he should do to at least try to get a fair and impartial judge assigned to this case? Because here's the thing, Brian, if this case goes to trial and Judge Cannon remains the presiding judge, I don't think anybody will be able to have confidence in the outcome, in the results of the trial, because it sure doesn't feel like we, the people, are going to get a fair shake.
Glenn, we've seen from Merrick Garland to Jack Smith, and I don't want to equate the two because I think that Jack Smith has been far more aggressive, appropriately so, than Merrick Garland has. But is there kind of a theme of just overly cautiousness from the government that you're seeing or that has existed since before this? I mean, this is really the first instance where most of the American people are paying attention to the cases being brought by the U.S. government. Is this like a pervasive theme that's existed well before the Trump trials?
You know, I spent decades, literally decades, inside the Department of Justice as a federal prosecutor. One thing I saw firsthand was undue timidity to bring challenging cases or novel cases, cases in which maybe we had to take a maiden legal voyage, do something for the first time, like prosecute a criminal former president of the United States. But to Jack Smith's credit, he's brought not one, but two federal prosecutions against Donald Trump. But what I saw was an undue timidity, a fear of loss, a fear of embarrassment, a fear that if we brought cases particularly that were politically fraught or politically charged cases, federal prosecutors were so concerned, indeed consumed, with the risk that people were going to accuse them of bringing political prosecutions, accuse them of being motivated by partisan politics, which in my experience was never the case. But rather than bring those cases and suffer the inevitable criticism, secure in the knowledge that what you were doing was right, so often the prosecutors would find reasons not to bring those cases. This is something that I railed against and fought against the entire time I was inside the Department of Justice. I ended up bringing cases that had sort of novel legal theories attached to them. And guess what? Sometimes I won those cases and we made law in the appellate courts. Sometimes I lost those cases. But I wasn't afraid of the loss, and I wasn't afraid of the criticism that might come because we were taking a maiden legal voyage. That is what I fear is in short supply at the Department of Justice these days.
It's also having the unintended consequence of when you don't do something because you're worried about the optics being too political, you are in effect doing something that is political. But by bending over backwards, not to seem political one way, you're actually conferring all of this undue partisan political benefit onto the other side because they know that you're going to be too afraid to bring these cases, that you're going to be too afraid to go balls to the wall, basically. And so you'll just be as timid as you can. And that really advantages the other side.
Brian, let me follow up on that because it's such a good point. And here is where you can see that sort of in its most egregious form. We have members of Congress who asked for pardons because they knew they'd committed crimes on and around January 6th, and they wanted to get away with those crimes. That is virtually a confession. And yet, not a single member of Congress, past or present, has been held accountable for any of the crimes that they knew and they announced they participated in by requesting pardons. They are allowed to continue to try to kill us from within. And that is such an abdication of the responsibility of the Department of Justice to make sure they address that win, lose, or draw, that, it is part of, if we look back and we've lost our republic, that will be part of the reason why.
Glenn, for posterity here, what is the likelihood of this trial happening before the election now? I feel like I know the answer, but I have to ask.
Yes, slim to none, and slim is fading fast. But we're always looking for a silver lining that is lurking somewhere behind the, big, dark orange cloud that is Donald Trump. And there actually is a silver lining here. Let's face it, Judge Cannon was never going to force this case to trial before the election. She has made that abundantly clear. She seems to be protecting the president who appointed her to the bench for the rest of her life tenure. But here's the good news. She has set no trial date. What does that mean? That means the other two trials, the other two criminal cases that are pending against Donald Trump, the federal prosecution in D.C. for his attempt to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election, and the RICO case down in Georgia that is pending against him for him interfering in the results of the Georgia state election. Those two cases can now be set, either one of them, for trial in August or in September if the sort of puzzle pieces fall into place. What do I mean by that? Well, in D.C., Judge Tanya Chutkan, who is the presiding judge in Donald Trump's federal prosecution in D.C., is just waiting for the Supreme Court to return the case to her, assuming they rule that a president is not a king and he can be prosecuted for the crimes he commits while in office. If they decide that within the next month or so and return the case to Judge Chutkan, guess what? There is no Florida trial standing in Judge Chutkan's way, and she can drop that trial on her calendar for August or September and perhaps get it tried before the November election. Similarly, if the Supreme Court continues to catch and kill that case, maybe we can look down to Georgia. We're still waiting for the first trial date to be set down in Georgia. Remember, some months ago, District Attorney Fani Willis requested an August trial date for at least the first batch of RICO defendants, and there's nothing saying that Donald Trump can't be one of the defendants in the first batch that goes to trial in Georgia. She asked for an August trial date. So if the Supreme Court continues to hang on to the absolute immunity case, doesn't give it back to Judge Chutkan, well, then our eyes will turn to Georgia, where maybe Donald Trump could be tried in, for example, September. All hope is not lost. And let's face it, we were never getting to trial in Florida, given the interference that's being run by Judge Cannon.
And that's an important point, because we'd actually spoken in a previous episode about how Judge Cannon could have boxed out the D.C. or the Georgia trial dates by setting a trial date for August down in Florida, for example, and then August would roll around and she would say, actually, we have to delay this thing. And so it would just continue to box everything out because, you know, the D.C. trial would have to not set their trial date because the Florida trial was purportedly going to be on a certain date. And she could have basically boxed out every other trial by imposing a trial date and then continuing to delay it over and over and over again. The fact that we now know that this trial in Florida has been delayed indefinitely does seem to present some type of a silver lining here, doesn't it?
Yeah, she was able to protect Donald Trump from going to trial in Florida, but maybe it was a bridge too far for Judge Cannon to sort of set a trial date that could be used as a sword by Donald Trump in Florida to fend off having other trial dates set in other cases. Maybe that one was a bridge too far for Judge Cannon.
And so now, if we do get a decision from the Supreme Court, do you know when that would be? And can you talk about the timeline of what we can expect in terms of whether Judge Chutkan did want to try to make this trial happen in D.C. before the election?
Yeah, so the end of the Supreme Court's term is June 30th. What does that mean? It means that if it's going to decide cases that were argued in this term of the Supreme Court, they would ordinarily issue the opinion by June 30th. So, but a couple of caveats. First of all, there is nothing that says the Supreme Court must rule in a case that they heard argument in the same term. They could kick it to the next term. They could kick it to the fall. I think that unlikely, but with this Supreme Court, you know, it's like all bets are off. We have no idea what their agenda is, particularly the agenda of the Justices Thomas and Alitos of this sad episode. But if they rule that Donald Trump can be tried for his crimes, he's not a king, he's not a dictator, then they would promptly remand or return the case to Judge Chutkan, and then she can simply put it on her trial calendar. Now, recall, she said she's going to give the parties about 88 days, which represents the time that there was from the day the Supreme Court put a stop to her trial until the time the trial was supposed to begin. It was 88 days. She said, look, when the Supreme Court gives it back to me, I'll give the parties 88 days. Now, she can cut that down to, for example, 60 days. So if she gets it back, let's say, the end of June, she could start the trial the end of August, and we could still get a verdict well in advance of the November presidential election.
Okay, well, we'll obviously stay on top of all of these prosecutions as they continue to play themselves out. We do now know, unfortunately, that it's very, very unlikely that we'll see a Florida prosecution happen before the 2024 election. But of course, we'll stay on top of the DC prosecution and the Manhattan prosecution that's happening right now. So for those watching, if you want to follow along with that trial as well as the other ones that we're waiting on, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on this screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.